Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about congruence in triangles and what that looks like. You're going to need your notes, that foldable I handed out in class, a calculator, and a writing utensil. Okay, for starters, let's start here with the tough quiz question. We need to figure out which one of my three options over here to the right matches the option on the left. Okay, so if you look as we go along, does one match this first triangle? Doesn't quite look like it. It looks like this is a 90-degree angle. This isn't quite a 90-degree angle, so I would say it's not number one. If I look at number two, it looks like I just took this triangle and slid it right over here. Looks to seem like the acute angle at the top matches. And three, we can clearly tell that these sides are a little long for what they should be, so three should not be an option. So my number two option would then match the one on the left. So another question where this might get a little harder, which one of these options, 1, 2, or 3, matches the picture on the left? Okay, again, if we look here, this one looks to be a little bit small for the one I'm looking for. Okay, the one on the far right seems to be a little too tall. It's supposed to be a T, tall. So the one in the middle must be my option. So I would say number two again would be my best option for this match. So finally, what happens here? If I'm trying to match my first object on the left, does it look most similar to 1, 2, or 3? Okay, if it kind of looks like 3, if I took it and I just rotated it maybe 180 degrees, it could maybe match. Second one, I don't think it matches that one due to the fact that the legs are way too long. The third one, not even the same shape. So 1 would be the best match for my object on the left. So why does this even matter? We need to figure out what congruency means. So congruent, again, just means equal. Our symbol we have for congruent is the equal sign with a little bar on top. Hope we haven't forgotten that. So if I take a figure and we're asking if they look congruent, that means everything should still be equal. So the definition of a congruent figure would be all the parts of one figure are congruent, and that just means equal, to the corresponding parts of another. So corresponding means they happen or they are the same spot on both triangles. So same spot if you want to jot that down. Okay, now corresponding parts, again, like I said, those are parts of the figure that are in the same position. So looking here, we've denoted the parts that are congruent. BC is the bottom line of my triangle, and it's congruent to EF. Likewise, AB is the side on the left, and DE looks to be like that corresponding part on my second triangle. And the angles we've marked with 1, 2, or 3 arches. The arches that have 1 would be congruent. The arches, if you have 2 arches, those 2 would be congruent. So now the most important part of this slide that you should probably write down in your notes is the congruent statement. This is what we'll deal a lot with this congruent statement. So the congruent statement is corresponding vertices are listed in the same order. So this is really important. We need to make sure here A corresponds to D. So that means when I'm writing their congruency statement, the A and the D come first. Okay, so then the next one we might look at B. Angle B corresponds with angle E, so they should become my second point. Okay, and the last one would be C, which corresponds to F, so they should also be in the same spot when I write that. And I use this symbol, which means congruent. And I have that triangle symbol out front because we're dealing with triangles. Okay, so let's do a little practice with this. So again, like I said, when two figures are congruent, their corresponding angles and corresponding sides are congruent. Okay, again, corresponding just means the same spot on both triangles or both figures. Okay, and so that means we also need to make sure their sides and their angles match up perfectly. They have to have the same shape and size in order to be congruent. So in this example that we start out with, we're given that the congruent statements, we know the figure on the left, or figure number 1, is congruent to figure number 2. Okay, so what this tells me is that A and F, since they both come first, those are my corresponding parts. Okay, so A and F must be equal to each other. So in order to show that, I would put maybe one arch in there. Okay, likewise that B and G come second, so that means B is congruent to G. Okay, and we could do this for all the letters. C comes third, H comes third, so that means C, if I put 3 here, and 3 on H, those are my corresponding angles. Again, D is that fourth one, I is the fourth one, so D, I'm going to mark it like this time, just a little bit different. Okay, and then lastly we have E, I'll mark 2 of those, and J congruent. So now I found all those congruency angles, and I could write them out as such. Angle A congruent to angle F, angle B congruent to angle G, and so on and so forth. So if you want to take time to jot that down, it wouldn't be a bad idea. Okay, but not only do we know all the sides are congruent, we also know then not only do we know all the angles are congruent, but we also know corresponding sides are congruent. So the way we can tell if they're corresponding sides, if you look here, A to B, so A to B would be one side of my figure. The corresponding side would be the first and second letters in your second part of your congruency statement, so that'd be F to G. Okay, so then if we look here, B and C comes next, and G and H, that means B and C should be congruent to G and H. Okay, C to D and H to I, so I could draw 3 on there. Okay, and then I have D to E, and I have I to J, so then I draw 4 on there. And then lastly, from A to E, so the start to finish, F to J. So that would be your 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we could write these statements, segment A, B, congruent to segment F, G, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of what I'm going to be asking of you on your assignment, is to tell me which parts are corresponding, making sure you're using the correct notation if it's an angle or if it's in a segment. So example 2 wants us to figure out if the two shapes or trapezoids are congruent. So that means that all angles and all sides, the corresponding sides, have to be the same. So let's start with sides. So A to B is 15. If I were to turn this 90 degrees clockwise, okay, if I turn 90 degrees clockwise, it looks like the corresponding side would be here, and they match up, so that's a check. 4 and 4 match up, 15 and 15 match up, and 10 and 10 match up. So not only do my sides have to match up, but also my angles. So angle A should match up with angle E, angle D should match up with angle H. B and C look to both be 100, so yes, I can assume these are congruent. So now how do I write my congruency statement? Here's where you want to write out your letters. So if I start here, if I start with A, I go to B, I go to C, and then I go to D. So I know that figure A, B, C, D is congruent. So now A corresponded to E. So that first letter in my second one better be E. Okay, B then corresponded to F. C corresponds to G. And D corresponds to H. So this is how we'd write that congruency statement, making sure all of your vertices match up. So the next examples we're looking at is you need to determine whether or not they are congruent or not. Okay, so I'm going to have you look back at the definition of congruency and tell me in this 1 example, 2 example, and 3 example. I'm going to have you fill those in your notes. That's what I'll check on class, whether they're congruent or not. In order to be congruent, that means all sides and all angles, excuse me, I should write corresponding in here, are congruent. So double check that in all of those, see if you can get me an answer, and we'll talk about that on Monday. So example 4 gets into a little bit more algebra. Okay, so here we have the congruency statement, which tells us F is congruent to R. I'm going to mark that on my picture. F is congruent to R. We also know that G is congruent to S. And we know T is congruent to H. So since I know they are congruent, I could fill that in over here. I could put the 65 here, and I could put the 55 here, and then we know there's 180 degrees in a triangle, so you could set it up that way. Or we also know that F is congruent to R. So if I figure out what F is, if I calculate that out, I'd get that F is equal to 60 degrees. So if I know F is 60 degrees and I know R is the measure 2x plus 30, since I know that they're congruent, congruent means equal. So then I can set up an equation, 2x plus 30 equals 60. So if I go to work and I solve for x, I'd get 2x equals 30, and then x ends up being 15. So there's a couple different ways you can solve this. If you want to try it by adding them all up to equal 180, you can do that as well. So here, let's talk about finding the value of x and y. Okay, so if I'm looking at the value x and y, this means I have to look at which angles, since they're talking about angles, correspond to each other. And it looks like we're talking about angle C here, and angle C corresponds to the one with one arch, which that would be angle D. So these two are equal or congruent. So if I were to start by setting up an equation, I would put 1/2 x plus 1 equal to 31. So I'd have 1/2 x, I want to get that one to the other side, so I would subtract it, equals 30. Okay, and then I can divide by 1/2, or in order to get rid of that 2, I can multiply by the reciprocal. Multiply by the reciprocal, 2 over 1 is just 2, so then I end up getting x, these cancel out, x equals 60. Okay, next I'm going to have you solve for your y. Notice which vertice your y value corresponds to. Which angle does that y value correspond to? Have y solved for Monday, and I will see you in class.